Hello, everyone. I am ZHAO Chuang. Let's get to know Duke the Spinops. Spinops is a ceratopsian dinosaur that lived in Canada during the Late Cretaceous. Its prominent features make it look quite exaggerated among ceratopsians. At a glance, you can see that it has two antenna-like long horns, a very large nasal horn, and two short horns above the eyes. All these are its most striking features. Spinops was not big, with a body length of about 5 meters. Its fossils are mainly concentrated in its head, which shows its distinctive features just mentioned. In fact, its fossils were discovered as early as the first decade of the last century, but they were shelved, collecting dust in the warehouse. It took more than 90 years before people began to notice this specimen and conduct research. Spinops is a centrosaurine in the family Ceratopsidae. Of course, some people now have disputes about this classification. In the past, we divided ceratopsids into two subfamilies, centrosaurine and chasmosaurine. The chasmosaurine is the group that Triceratops belongs to, with all the members generally looking similar to Triceratops. Members of this group all had a large head frill with small spines and no exaggerated horns, and tended to have shorter nasal horns and two longer brow horns. Centrosaurines were just the opposite. Their head frills were often smaller with many fancy hornlets, and their nasal horns were generally very large. Spinops was exactly the latter. However, some people have raised disagreements over the years, saying that the appearance of ceratopsians was quite complex. Many counterexamples of the mentioned diagnosed characteristics of these two groups existed. A good example is the Chasmosaurus, which had no brow horns as a chasmosaurine. Not all centrosaurines possessed very large nasal horns, such as the Pachyrhinosaurus, which did not even have a nasal horn. But in any case, Spinops was indeed closer to the species of Centrosaurus, especially its facial features. Although it looked unique, if you observe it carefully, you will find it is just a slightly deformed version of other centrosaurines. We compare it with the model Centrosaurus, and you will see their general characteristics are similar. Although the head of Spinops was shaped somewhat differently from that of Centrosaurus, there were still some similar parts. For example, the mouth of Spinops was relatively round, which is also a typical feature of centrosaurines. Dinosaurs like Styracosaurus or Pachyrhinosaurus had a very round and thick nasal cavity. Then, the nasal horns of these two dinosaurs were quite large. The nasal horn of this Centrosaurus pointed forward, but the nasal horns of other Centrosaurus might point in different directions. Some Centrosaurus individuals had their nasal horns facing forward, some backward, and some similar to this. The nasal horn of Spinops was more exaggerated, with the size a bit like that of Stellosaurus or Rubeosaurus. They all had small brow horns above the eyes, and relatively small spike-like structures on the side of the head frill. The number of these spikes was also similar. On the top of their head were located for specialized horns. Here, Spinops had two long upward-pointing horns, and Centrosaurus had two inward-hooking horns. What's below were two downward-drooping horns. So, at first glance, Spinops looked different from Centrosaurus, but with careful observation, you will find that all its features are basically similar to Centrosaurus, so these two dinosaurs had a very close affinity. Of course, Spinops still had its unique characteristics. Its appearance was quite exaggerated. Its body size was not very big. The body of Spinops was typical of ceratopsians. It had stout limbs and well-developed shoulder muscles. Since the head of the ceratopsians was relatively massive, their shoulder girdle muscles must be significantly developed. Its neck was thick, and the rear of its head contained muscles, extending from the posterior of its lower jaw into the head frill. This part of the head frill was a hollow structure, but the filled muscle made its front and rear sides appear plump when alive. Its ears had a depression between the jugal horns and the frill, and at this location, this structure was theoretically believed to help ceratopsians see what was behind their bodies. We know that the head frill of ceratopsians was relatively huge. Under normal conditions, the eyes would be blocked by the head frill when they were looking at the back. However, when it lowered its head like this, the eyes were just at the same level as the gap next to it, and it saw things behind its body by slightly turning its head. This is a pretty smart structure, a bit like a car rearview mirror. In addition to its sturdy limbs, it also had a very robust body cavity. Ceratopsians had a very wide pelvis. If you look down from the top, its torso was rounded. Its ribs were generally arched. When its body twisted, its front half might move a little more, and there was not much movement in the back half. Because its pelvis extended forward all the way here, the ribs on both sides became constantly shortened and grew tightly closed to the pelvis, which caused the rear half of its body to be basically locked. So the whole body looked relatively stiff and could not move flexibly. Moreover, on the neural spines of many ceratopsians, there were a large number of interlaced ossified tendons. This structure limited its flexibility to swing left and right, but would strengthen the body. Compared with most dinosaurs, ceratopsians tended to have a relatively short tail, which might be true for Spinops. Although its collected tail fossils are incomplete, we still have reason to speculate that its tail might be relatively short. The hind limbs of Spinops were very thick, especially its thighs. As the upper part of its pelvis was very broad, the top of its thighs was also very broad. Its entire thigh formed a huge triangle, and its shank was muscular. There might be a skin membrane on the back of its legs, which extended to the tail. This feature also existed in some primitive ceratopsians, such as Psittacosaurus. The later ceratopsians might not be as exaggerated as Psittacosaurus, but their legs might have adherent membranes at this location. Spinops did not have skin fossils found currently, but we can speculate its appearance based on the preserved skin of the centrosaurines. It might have delicate, tiny scales densely arranged on its body, mixed with relatively large ones. The large scales might be arranged in rows or irregularly distributed on the body surface. Its abdomen had very fine grid-shaped scales. Next, Spinops possessed typical ceratopsian limbs. Its forelimbs had 5 fingers, 3 of which were functional for walking, and the other 2 had degenerated and became pretty small. Its hind limbs had 4 toes. The first was tiny and could play an auxiliary role, and the other 3 were the main functional toes for walking. Good, the above concludes our introduction to Duke the Spinops. Thank you all.